So this is our URL shortener, where we can type in some URL like NovelTech media, submit. Then we receive a shortened URL, which we can copy and click, and it's going to redirect us to our web page. We can do that again. We could create the same URL for a YouTube video. We can just copy it, and it's going to redirect us to the YouTube video. Great. We can also hit the route analytics to see which URLs are shortened and how many views each one of them has. This is the project we are going to build out. Let's break it into steps. Okay, how are we going to develop this? First of all, we are going to develop the functionality. We are going to develop the URL shortener, we are going to develop the classes, the routes, we are going to configure Flask, we are going to create ORMs, we are going to have an SQLite database. After we have completed the skeleton, the initial functionality of the application, we are going to create the views. We are going to use a templating engine to create some basic views that I have just showed you. And we are also going to have some basic authentication to protect certain routes. We are going to protect the analytics route so that only admins can have a look into those. We are going to use a lot of different technologies. We are going to use Flask, we are going to use environments, we are going to use a database, we are going to use SQL Alchemy, and we are going to use many more useful and common Python modules. If I got your attention, let's get started. The first thing we would like to do is install Flask and the python.env package. We are going to use those packages to create our application. First of all, we are going to install Flask. For doing that, navigate to your folder and just type in pip install Flask. I have already installed Flask, so it's going to say requirements already satisfied. Another package you should install is the python.env package. This package is used to declare environment variables. So what are environment variables? When we are running our application, we are creating an environment, and we want to have certain variables that we can store inside a file. That could be some usernames, database connection strings, and so on, that we want to load into our application and make it available throughout the entire application. So let's start by creating our first folder. We're going to call the folder URL Shortener. Okay, so far so good. Now let us create the environment variables. First of all, we are going to create a .env variable. Now let us also create another file .flaskenv, which is going to be our Flask environment. So let's first fill out the variables we are going to need. Navigate to the .env file, and we are going to need the following variables. We are going to use a database, so this means we will need a database URL. We are going to use an SQLite database, so just type in SQLite db.sqlite3. Great. We are also going to need an admin password, because we are also going to have some authentication, and for that we are going to need a password, which we can specify as password, and we are going to also have an admin username, which will be just admin. Great. Navigate to flaskenv and set the following variables. Flask app. We need to specify the name of our application. So this is going to be the folder which inside our application lives. And in this case, the folder is URL Shortener. So the name here needs to be URL Shortener. Then we are also going to specify an environment. which in this case will be development. So the environment is also important when launching your application. You can always check for the environment if it's development or production, and maybe run some tests in development or start certain protocols and run certain scripts that you, for example, only run in development or only in production. Okay, now that we have set this up, we need to create an initializer inside of our URL shortener. So let us first create the init file. So init.py. So files named like that, so files named init.py are used to mark directories as Python package directories. So this means that if we declare something inside of init.py, we are going to be able to import certain modules from that in other modules. So if we create another module, we will be able to import packages like package.run or something like that. So that's why we use init files. So here, first of all, we are going to create our Flask application. In order to create our application, we are going to define a function called createApp, where we are going to pass a configuration file. So the config file will be, now we need to actually provide a configuration file. We are later going to create a settings.py file where we will configure all the needed variables to start our Flask application. So now app is equal Flask name. The next line of code is app.config from py file config file. I will explain in a second what I'm exactly doing here, but let us just import Flask before that. From Flask import Flask. Okay, so far so good. Okay, so this is some type of skeleton that we use to initialize a Flask application. We need to provide a configuration file, which we are going to create shortly, and then we just create the Flask app here, and we provide the name. So the name variable is a special Python variable which just gives us the name of the script. If we are, for example, executing the script in which we have the name file, it is going to be equal to main. So then we could have something like this, if name is equal to main. And if we are not executing that script directly, it is just going to have the name of the script. And the next line of code is actually configuring our application to use the configuration file that we have provided here. This is just some standard way of initializing a Flask app, which you can always look up on the official Flask documentation. So now let us create the settings file. Go back to our folder here, click create new file, and let's create the settings.py file. Inside of here, we will need only one import, and this is OS, to be able to access our environment variables, which you will see in a few seconds. So here we will define our database URI. I will call this SQL Alchemy database URI, which is going to be equal to our OS environ.get. So when accessing the OS, we can access certain files in our environment, we can open directories and so on. And over the environ variable, we can also access all our environment variables. As you remember, we have defined our database URL here. So inside of settings, we can actually call that by typing in database URL. And if you're confused what SQL Alchemy is, this is a Python SQL toolkit and an object relational mapper. So this means that throughout SQL Alchemy, we can communicate with the database. We can create GET requests, we can select files from our tables, we can write to our tables, we can query and change the data. So this is basically like, if you're familiar with Java, it's something like Hibernate. So this is an ORM created for Python. There are other variables which you can specify here. We are also going to specify the track notifications to be false. You can of course go to sqlalchemy.org. There is an entire documentation around that and the possible functions and use cases you can do there. So now let us create our admin username, which is going to be equal to OS, environ again, and get admin username. Now let us define our admin password, which is equal to os environ.get admin password. Okay, to wrap this up, once again, we are having all that information here in the settings file, which is being loaded when initializing our Flask application. We are providing the name of the current script, and we are passing the config file to the Flask function from PyFile, which is pretty much self-explanatory what it does, and we are passing all the data. Then inside of our settings file, we are accessing the data from our environment and passing it in here throughout the OS module, which stands for operating system. So this is a best practice to do this, since all our data is stored inside the .n variable, and for example, if there is some critical data, or in most cases there is, we aren't going to push those files to a repository. So everything is going to be inside the repository, but the environment files are not going to be there, which is, for example, great for safety and great if multiple people are interacting with the same code bases. Okay, the next step will be to actually create our database and create the models and extensions for our database. So basically the model is going to include all the data that is going to be stored inside our table. So first of all, let us install a package. As we have already mentioned, we are going to need to install Flask SQL Alchemy, which I have already installed here from earlier on. Okay, great. Now let us create our models file. So call it model.py and create one more file called extensions.py. Before we actually create the model, let us first go to extensions.py and do a simple import from Flask SQL Alchemy import SQL Alchemy. Now, SQL alchemy. And now we just need to initialize our database by calling the constructor SQL alchemy and close the parentheses. Okay, now since we have initialized the database, let us return to the init file and let us import from .extensions import db. So this is a way how we can import the other scripts inside of our Python application by just, if it's in the same directory, by just typing in a dot and the name of the script, and then importing actually the variable that we want to import. Or we could also type in a star, which would import all the variables we need. One more thing we need to do now is just to initialize our database by typing in db init app and passing our application as the variable. So if you are somehow stuck or are not sure why I'm using certain scripts or lines, you can always refer to the documentation where it is explained in more detail. For example, with SQL Alchemy, this is a way how to initialize it. There are certain processes going underneath that. If you want to learn those or maybe want to go deeper into understanding that, then you should always refer to the documentation. Since pretty much every function has something going under the hood for it, we can't always go into that depth when explaining those functions, but I will always try to refer to the documentation to help you out if you're interested. Now we can finally go back to the model and create our model. So first of all, we will need to import the database, or better said, our database object. Oops. Now we will also need to import datetime. From datetime, import datetime. This is sometimes confusing because if you don't import it like that, you end up using datetime like this, datetime, calling it twice. But this is how the package is structured. Let us create our class now. We will call our class link, and as parameters we will pass the db model as our parameter. Now we just need to define the columns that our application, that our table is going to have. First of all, we are going to have an ID. This is going to be equal db dot column. So we are referring to our database object and we are creating a column on it. That column will be an integer and we will set the primary key to be true, which means it will be the primary key and it will be auto-generated in our database. So then we will have an original URL, so the base URL that the users are going to type in. Again, the same process for creating the column, db.string, and we can also specify the maximum number of characters that that string can have. We are going to specify 1024, which is probably an overkill, but we are going to leave room for that. Now we are going to specify a short URL, which will be our shortened URL. Again, we are going to create a column and we will use a string with 6 characters as maximum. So this is something you also need to consider because 6 characters, the maximum number of combinations achievable with 6 characters will be the maximum number of URLs we can have. So if you're going to have billions and billions of users and even more URLs, we will need to have, or we would need to have a larger cap there. But if you want to do that, you can just increase the number here, which shouldn't be a problem. And one other thing is that it needs to be unique. And in order to set that, we will just use the parameter unique and set it to true, because we can't generate two short URLs that are the same for different original URLs. Now we will also add a bit of tracking. We will track the number of views or the number of clicks on that link. So we will create another column here, which will be an integer again. And we also need to provide a default value, which will be 0, because when the short URL is created, the default number of views is going to be 0. Then we will also have a date created. So we are going to create a new column there with db date time, and the default will be the moment that this link is created. So this will be datetime.now. And if you're a bit lost, I'm going to refer to the documentation here, where you can exactly see what we have done here. We have created a class for our model. You can also see all the possible types you can use, how they are structured. You can, for example, set things like it's nullable, if it's unique, the maximum size of the variable, and so on. So if you want to go deeper into that, you can again refer to the documentation here. I'm quite often referring to the documentation because this is extremely important. It is impossible to learn everything by just watching through the tutorial. Even if you manage that, you would forget most of the things you learn. So because of that, it is important to know how to read the documentation and how to search for what you need. For example, if you're following this tutorial but not 100% exactly like I'm doing it, maybe you're adding some other type of functionality, then this is even better. Then you can always go to the documentation, see what you need, refer to the things I'm explaining, and learn that way. This will bring you much further than by just exactly and blindly following what I'm typing in. Now we need to create a function that is going to create a short URL. So let us define an init function that is going to be initialized when we create an object of our class. Here I'm just using a standard way of defining an init function, which can take multiple arguments. And then we're going to call the super constructor on it and call init on the super constructor, passing the parameters that we have received. This is just a standard way of defining the init function. So this also can be looked up in the documentation I have just mentioned. Now we need to create the short URL. So let us do that. Short URL is going to be equal to self generate short link. Now we need to create that function, generate short link. Let's write define generate short link and pass self. So let me explain a little bit what we have done here. So here we are passing multiple parameters as arguments, and we're calling the super constructor on that. It's always a good practice to do. Then we are creating a variable short URL. We're calling self on it to bind that variable to the exact instance of our link. So link is a class and we can create instances of that class. So here we are just defining a variable that is binded to a certain instance of that class. And every time a new link is being created, we are going to generate the short link. Now we are going to actually define the code how we are generating the short link. So we are going to create a bunch of characters here with the following function: string.digits plus string dot ASCII letters, which is just going to give us a combination of digits and ASCII letters. We also need to import that one. So let us import string, and we will also need to import random from I misspelled that. From random we are going to import choices. So this is going to help us to just generate some random characters. Let us return here. Now we can create a short URL, which is going to be equal to an empty string on which we are going to join. Now we are going to randomly choose characters. So we are going to call choices on the characters that we have created, and we are going to specify the number of characters that we are creating, which in this case is 6. I have already mentioned that we want to have a maximum of 6 here in the short URL, and we are going to create 6. You can do with less or with more. It just extends the possible number of choices you have. So here we have generated just digits from 0 to 9, and all the ASCII letters A, B, C, D, and so on. And here we are just choosing 6 random characters out of those that we have created. Now we need to check the link if it already exists. So we are going to call on self query filter by, and now we are going to filter by the short URL we have just generated here, and we are going to call first on that. So basically what we are doing here is we are querying our database to see if we already have a record or a short URL that we have just generated. Then we are going to check that. If link equals to something, then we are recursively going to return again generate short link. So what we are doing here is, if we find something, then we are going to enter this if statement, and then we are going to return another call to the same function. So we are creating a recursive function here for as long as the link has some value. When we find a link, so when we generate a new link that isn't already in the database, then we are going to return short URL. And by returning short URL, we exit the recursion and we retrieve the short URL we have created. So here you can also, on this line here, you can refer to the documentation to see how the ORM works, since we are creating a class that is being that represents a model for our database. This is a way how we can query that. Since we are inside the class, we don't have an object yet, so we are calling on self query. So if we had created an object here like link is equal to link, then we would call the query on the link object. But since we are inside the class here and there is no object yet, we are calling it on self. So since we have finished this, it is time to actually create the routes. So the routes will return some front end in which we can interact with the models and the database we have just created. So let us do exactly that and create a new file called routes.py. First of all, from Flask, import blueprint. I will explain in a second what blueprint is, but first let us initialize it we can call it shortener. So this is how we are going to call our route. And initialize blueprint. We need to pass it a name, which will be shortener. And we need to pass, as you can remember from earlier, the name of the script that we are running right now. The concept of a blueprint allows us to group routes together that have some type of consistency or similarity across them to make the development of larger projects or projects that span across multiple files easier. So here is the official documentation. Flask uses a concept of blueprints for making applications, components, and supporting common patterns within an application or across applications. Blueprints can greatly simplify how large applications work and provide a central means for Flask extensions. As I have already said, it groups certain routes together to make the development easier. So I'm going to show you what I mean by that. So we have created our shortener. So on our shortener, we can define a route. Let us define our first route. It always needs to start with a slash. We are going to have a parameter here. So the short URL parameter. After that, we are going to define a function. This is going to be redirect to URL. So basically, this is the route when someone uses our link. He is going to hit this route where we are going to redirect him. So we have passed the parameter short route. So we can use that parameter here in the function. And as of now, I'm just going to write return empty string. We will fill those out first when we define all routes. So let us define our next route. It's the same principle. Shortener route slash. This will be our create link route. And the methods that we are going to support here will only be post methods. Then we are going to define create link. In which we are again going just to return an empty string. The next route we are going to create will be our root, our index. This is our index. We are going to define the index. And again, we are for now just going to return an empty string. We will have one more route for analytics where we can track our views. You could add some other type of analytics there as an exercise. We are again going to define our function called analytics. And as of now, we are again just going to return an empty string. And one more thing we need is an error handler. So we are going to define shortener error handler is going to receive a 404 page not found. We're going to define page not found. And we are going to return something like, could create an h1 tag and write page not found 404, close the h1 tag and send the 404. Of course, we could create this in a nicer way. By using a template and having HTML page that actually displays that, but for this purpose we are just going to keep it like that. Now that we have initialized our routes, created our routes, we need to import them in our init function. So from routes, import shortener, the shortener we have just created. And then we need to register the blueprint by calling .register blueprint and passing the shortener. And then we just need to return. So far so good. We have created our routes, which we can hit over the browser. We have registered our blueprint. Now it's time to create the templates. With templates, I mean the HTML files for which are going to actually return some views for the routes we hit. So let us first create the folder templates. It has to be named templates since our blueprint is going to search for those HTML files inside the templates folder. So first of all, let us create the index template. So that's going to be an index.html file. First, in order to make it a bit more stylish, we're going to use Bootstrap. So go to the Bootstrap website. So I'm just going to paste the style sheet. In our index, we are going to have a form. Inside of that form, we are able to input our original URL and just press submit, which will redirect us to a new site where we will be able to see our original URL and our new URL. And then we're just going to need the redirection file, where when we are hitting already a URL, we're just going to redirect to the original URL. So let us create the form. First of all, it's going to have a method of post. Then we are going to have, then we are going to have an action, which is going to be the following one. Need to put those here. This is just going to be a pretty simple HTML file. Since we are not really going to go deep into front-end development here, and I wouldn't really suggest this type of front-end development for more complex projects. We would rather build a completely different front-end which is calling those APIs, but for this purpose this is more than enough. So this will hit to the shortener dot create link, and then we just need a style for our form. Great. So the method is post, since we want to post something when clicking on the form, and the action that is being executed is going to be executed on the shortener route here that we have defined on the create link route. So this is all interconnected. We can access those routes from here. And for styles, we're going to have a max width of 800 pixels. We are going to have a margin of, let's say, 50 pixels. And that should be actually enough for the form. Now, let us create a div here. And let us create a button. The button will be of type submit, so that when clicking the button, the action on the form is going to be executed. And then we're just going to provide the Bootstrap class, which you can again look on the official Bootstrap website. So this is just going to be a primary button primary. Okay, and we need a text. We're going to write submit, and here we need an input field. So first of all, let us create a class of form group here. And let us create a label and input. So we're going to have a label and we're going to have an input. Great. Inside the label, we are going to write original URL, and we are going to give it a for of original URL. You can skip this one as well. and we are going to give it some style. Like we're going to go with a greater font size of like 28 pixels. And basically that would be everything we need to style there. Now we need just to provide our input. It's going to be text. We're going to give it the class of form control. So basically I'm just using Bootstrap here and creating a basic HTML page. You can also skip through this or just copy the code, or you can use your own style for creating this. We will give a placeholder of enter URL, and we will give it a name of original URL. Great. I think that should be everything we need for our index page. Now, let us return to our routes and go to this route where we can actually render our template now. In order to do that, just call the render template function, and we will pass the index.html. So this is all interconnected, a way of doing stuff in Flask. So this is also the reason I mentioned at the beginning that we need to name this folder templates. Now we just need to import this render template. We will also need a few other packages. We'll need request, and we will need redirect later on for the other routes. Great, so far so good. So it's time to test our application now. Let's get back to the console. Type in Flask run, and our server should be running now, running on localhost 5000. So we can ignore this warning here. Let's go to localhost 5000, and yeah, that's it. We can enter a URL. Like, no, it shouldn't work as of now, but we should be able to press submit. Okay, great. We could redirect it to create link, but create link isn't returning anything besides an empty string as of now. So we need to work on that one now. Okay, let us implement the create link route now. So we are receiving data from here. We are receiving the original URL from this input here. So we need to get used with it. So let us do that. We are going to extract that original URL from the request. Remember, we have imported request here earlier. From a form with the original URL. So you again could get into the documentation of request. We can access the form tags from here, and we can access the name of the input that is passing us the data. So now we have access to the original URL. Now we need to create a new link with setting the original URL equal to original URL. But before we do that, we just need to import two modules here. From extensions, we need to import db, and from models, we need to import link. So now that our link is created, we need to save that progress. So we can call db session add. We're going to add our link, and we can call db session commit to save our changes. So if you refer to the documentation, you can see under sessions that we can access our data throughout the session, in which we can commit our changes, we can query the database, and so on. Now, after we have created a new link, created a database session, added the link, committed the changes, we need to return render template, which is going to be link success, which will provide us the original URL and the new URL we have created. We will also pass some parameters there. We will pass the new URL to be equal to link.short URL, and we will pass the original URL to be equal to link dot original URL. So when rendering the template in the link success.html file, we will be able to access those two variables. So let us create that one. Under templates, let's create our link success.html file. So let's again refer to Bootstrap. We're going to import a link here, and we're just going to have a p class. We're going to give it a text left, and then we are going to define our own style. We're going to have a cursor of pointer. Oops, should be a small p. We are going to have a margin of 20 pixels. We are going to have a padding 6 pixels. We are going to have a border radius of, let's say, 8 pixels. We are going to have a font size of 22 pixels. We're going to have a background color RGB 154, 155, 199. You can of course style it as you would like. This is just something I use quite often, so I pretty much know it by heart. I'm gonna go with the max width of, again, 800 pixels. Great. We're going to write our original URL, and we will use our original URL parameter, as we have already said that we are passing the original URL and the new URL here. So let us copy this, and here we will just write our short URL, and here we will have our new URL. Yes, it's our new URL. One thing we need to do here is we would like to be able to navigate to that URL. So we are going to write URL for shortener redirect to URL. The short URL will be equal to our new URL, and we'll also set external to true, so that we are basically able, when clicking on the URL, to open a new tab and to navigate there. So what we are doing here is we are calling the redirect to URL here. When clicking on it, we are calling the redirect to URL, and we are passing the parameter of short URL, which we need here, to be our new URL, and we are making external equal to true. So let us test this again. Let's go to our localhost. Okay, we have an error here. Okay, we wrote this wrong. Okay, now let us type in Google, click submit, keyword original URL. Again, we made an error. We need to have a slash here. Okay, let us return now. Let's go with this YouTube video. Click submit. Okay. We are fine now. That is a good error. The next thing we should fix is actually initialize our database so that there is actually a place to store our data. And now we should define our database. One thing we need to do before, because we are using one terminal and we just stopped the execution, so our data is not going to be loaded into the environment. We need to change this here. Since only for the creation of the database, since we stopped our Flask application, we won't be able to load the environment here. We will just need to copy that and actually paste it in here. And after we have created the database, we can return it as normal. So this is only a once in a lifetime operation, so it's fine to leave it like that. So now let's type in Python and type the following thing in. From URL Shortener import create app from URL Shortener extensions import db from URL Shortener models import link, and then we're going to create our database by calling db create all and setting app equal to create app. Okay, I made a mistake here. It's app is set equal to create app. Close the parenthesis and click. Okay, that should be fine. We can now type in tables. Oh, sorry, we need first to quit here. I think we can call exit. Now we need to call SQLite 3 URL Shortener db SQLite 3. As you can see, there is a new SQLite 3 database being created here. And now we can click on tables, run Flask again, go back to the browser, type in a URL and type in submit. Template not found. Okay, we have made a misspelling here. Need success. Let us try again. There is one more problem. We forgot to set the parentheses here. I hope those should be all the problems we had. Okay, great. We are able to generate a new link. So take in mind that we are running on localhost. So this here is localhost, but if you were running on a domain like short.ly, then we would be running on https short.li, and then we would have this extension here. So, but as of now, we are able to generate those links. Let's go with something else like NovelTech submit, and yeah, great. 6 characters, and it's working fine so now. The only thing left to do is to go back to our router and actually create a route for redirecting our requests. Let us do exactly that. Let's remove the return here. Since we returned a short URL, we need to find that link. So we are going to call link query filter by, and we are going to pass the short URL as short URL, and we are going to call first or 404, which is just a function that we either find a link or we just return our 404, which will then be redirected to our error handler here and just tell the user that the page wasn't found. We need to increase our views to be link views +1. Then we need to call again our DB session to commit, and we will return a redirect to our original URL, which is just basically passing the URL here that we want to redirect the user to. Okay, let's test this out now. Let's copy that link, paste it in here, and great. We got navigated to NovelTech Media. So let's try this again and go with google.com, submit, copy that, paste it in, and great, we're being redirected to Google. Let's try it again with Bootstrap, paste it in, submit. Okay, now we can actually see how the URL can be shorter. Paste it in, and great, you're getting redirected to Bootstrap. So it's working fine. The only thing left is to add analytics, so we can see how many times a certain URL was opened. And we also want to use some type of authentication so that not everyone is able to access our app. So let's go with analytics. We are going to just query all, and we are going to return render template analytics.html, and we're going to pass the links to be equal to those links. So we need to go back to templates, create a new file called analytics.html. So what we need to do here is to create a for loop that is going to find a link in links, and then we need to close that loop here. And for this is just basic syntax for our templating engine. We can copy our P file from here, and we just need to change the files that we are displaying. So we want to display the original URL. So we are going to access our link.original original URL. So we are accessing this link, which is looping through those links which we passed here. Then some spacing, short URL. We're going to do the same, link.short URL, and display the views. Link.views. Okay, let's call analytics. Okay, great. Here we can see our URLs. Okay, the original URL is not being displayed for some reason. Okay, there is a typo. It should be original URL. So original URL. Okay, great. Now it works. So if you, for example, navigate to that one, localhost. Now this should increase. Okay. So this increased our views. Let's do it again. Localhost. Paste it in. And now we have 2 views. Great, the analytics is working as well. So there's just one thing left to do, and that would be having some type of authentication in our application. So let's create auth.py file. So first of all, from functools, let us import reps. And from Flask, let us import request, response, and current app. So we are going to define a check auth with the username and the password. We will just do a simple comparison here. So we are not going to develop a system where everyone can sign up and create their own account and have maybe a limit of how many URLs they can create and so on. That would be, it wouldn't be that hard to continue on our project on, but it would expand the project too much in comparison to what we are building right now. But if you would like to do that, please leave comments below, or if you're doing something like that, comment with other people and write what you have created so far. And we need to check for the password that it is equal to the current app config admin password. Now we need to have authenticate, which will return a response. We are just going to write some generic text here. And we are going to have a new line. You have to log in with proper credentials. So basically you could just write here whatever you would like. It's going to be a 401. And there's just one thing missing. www authenticate basic realm is equal to login required. Those are some standard error messages you would receive when fetching some proper APIs. And we are also going to have require auth, which will receive a function as parameter. Now we are going to define a rep. A rep is a higher order function that, so to say, reps another function underneath. The other function will be a decorated function with args and quargs. We are going to have auth is equal to request authorization. If not auth or not check auth with the username and password, we are just going to return authenticate again, which is the function we have written here. Otherwise, we are going to return our function again with args and quarks. And we are going to return decorated. Okay, So now we should be able to return to routes and import that. So go again to the top from auth, import requires auth, and then we can just use the requires auth. For example, I want to require auth here. Only people who are authorized can see into the analytics. So let us return here and open analytics. Great. Now we need to type in our admin and password. And again, we are able to see the analytics. Great. Now we could have a system, as I have already mentioned, where everyone can sign up for their account. And then maybe there could be a trial version, a premium version, and so on. If this is something you're interested in, then leave some comments down below. So this is basically it. We have created our app. We can enter URLs, we get the short URL, we get redirected. We can also track how many times we have opened that URL, and we have also some basic type of authentication. So I hope you had fun while developing this and you learned a lot on the way. So take a little break now and see you in the next project. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you had a lot of fun watching this tutorial. There is a lot of stuff we had learned. We have learned how to use Flask. We have learned much of the basic configurations, routes, and modules that come with Flask. We have also learned a bit about object-oriented programming. That is basically going across all the projects that we are building, but we have also bettered our knowledge there. We have gone into databases and configured a simple database. We have used SQL Alchemy as an object relationship mapper. We have used other Python modules and principles. We have configured .env environment for our application, and we have used many more Python functionalities. So I hope you feel much more knowledgeable after this one, and you learned a lot, and of course had a lot of fun. So take a little break, maybe go over some of the topics again, or you can skip to some other project if you would like, that interests you at the moment. So thank you for sitting through this tutorial, and see you in the next project.